Hey, good morning, everybody. Mr. Schultz again. We're going to do the last set of notes real quick for Module 1. This is Module 1, Lesson 3. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so still on ecosystem dynamics and interactions. That's Module 1. We are now going to move on to Lesson 3. You can see all of the objectives listed off to the right. And this title is going to be Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health. And we're going to cover several topics inside this. We'll go pretty quick. I do want to spend a couple minutes and just explain how we're going to do our Unit 1 test this week as well. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is not only defined by the number of different species that are living within an ecosystem, but also by the population size of each species, the genetic variation within the species, and the ecological diversity as well. So you see in the picture off to the side here, I have a picture of a coral reef. You see many different species of fish and corals and things like that are growing in this picture. So it's not just specifically how many different species, but we have to take other things into consideration as well. So this means that when we're measuring biodiversity of an area, we have to consider more than just the total number of species, right? If there's 100 different species within an ecosystem, one might jump to the conclusion that there is a high biodiversity in that area. However, if you looked a little deeper, a little more closely, you might find that one or two individuals from each species group are alive. So that means there's not a large population size with some of those species. And this would have a negative impact on the biodiversity because you cannot expect those populations to survive very long with such low numbers. Genetic variation is another thing we have to consider. Genetic variation among species in a population is also very important because it allows the population to have a higher resistance to changing conditions. For example, if we're talking about, and I'll use a couple examples, one of them's not here, but let's look at disease. If we have only a few organisms that are alive within a certain species and a disease comes through that area that affects them, and their genetic variation isn't too different from one another, they're all very similar, then if that disease, if one of those organisms is susceptible to that disease, then because there's not very much genetic variation, all of them could be susceptible to that disease. We can say the same thing. Here's another example that's on the notes here. We can talk about soil pH, right? So if the soil pH levels change within an ecosystem, then all the plants that have the same genes and they have a low tolerance for pH shifts in soil could be affected by that change in the environment, right? So all the plants could end up dying off because of the reduced biodiversity within the ecosystem. Along the same lines, having diverse ecological conditions provides a wide range of resources like food, water, shelter, and for the organisms to survive in. So ecosystem diversity or ecological diversity is important as well. If and there's a good example here with an invasive species, right? Especially if one of those resources is reduced or eliminated by a natural disaster or an invasive species. But let's just assume, and I'll give you the example here, if we have a certain species that feeds off of only one food source that's available in this ecosystem, right? There's one food source for this organism to feed off of in the ecosystem. If that food source goes away, well, then that organism that feeds off of it is going to go away as well. On the other hand, if you have the same organism, but the ecosystem has 5 or 6 different food sources that it can pick from or choose from, if one of those food sources disappears, well, then it can shift from eating that particular food source to one of the other 4 or 5 that are around, okay? So having ecological diverse conditions is important as well. So let's look at how ecosystems change, right? And how that in fact affects biodiversity, how it impacts biodiversity. So ecosystems are constantly going through change. Most of the time they're fairly stable and the change could be minimal and it won't have a huge effect. But every once in a while, we'll have a large change. For example, you can think of all the wildfires that are going on right now on the West Coast, right? So all these wildfires can have a huge impact on ecosystems. So when change occurs in an ecosystem, they may be affected. They may affect the biodiversity of that ecosystem as well. A good example is on the picture. We just mentioned wildfires like the one in the picture, or the ones that we're familiar with happening on the west coast of the United States right now, could affect species diversity within that particular ecosystem. Now, don't get me wrong. Certain species require fires to actually be able to reproduce. For example, Aldo Leopold, back in the 1920s, 1930s, I think, discovered that there are certain trees that their seeds, until they're heated up in conditions like a forest fire, won't be able to take root. They won't be able to produce new offspring. So some wildfires are necessary for the ecosystem, but when they get out of control, like the ones we're seeing on the West Coast, that's where they become problematic and can rage and possibly injure or hurt the ecosystem as a whole. Okay? So what happens after that forest fire is you have something called succession. Okay, and in this case it's secondary succession. We'll talk about both primary succession and secondary succession. But after a forest fire, what happens is you'll have these organisms start to rebound slowly, but they go through this progressive change, right? This succession of changes that occur. For example, after a forest fire, grasses, which grow relatively fast, are able to rebound quickly because the trees are no longer there competing for sunlight or water or nutrients in the soil. But other changes might take longer, right? The animals that lived in this area, maybe used the trees as their habitats, will probably have to find a different suitable place to live. They'll probably have to leave. And it's going to take a while for those trees or that forest ecosystem to get back to the way it was before the fire, so this could take decades, right? So although this is a drastic change, small changes can impact ecosystems as well. We could have, small changes in the amount of water or rainfall in a particular area. We could have a drought that occurs, and it might be something minor for some organisms, but maybe a little less water for certain other organisms is going to cause some kind of change in the ecosystem. So let's look at these two processes that I just mentioned, secondary and primary succession. We'll start with primary succession, which takes a little bit longer, and then we'll move into secondary succession. So what is primary succession? Primary succession is the ecological succession that begins in essentially a lifeless area. This is usually on bare rock, right? These are regions where there's no soil built up. No soil has been produced, and trees and plants can't take root. So it's basically incapable of sustaining life. This could be a recent lava flow, and we have volcanic rock that is there. Could be newly formed sand dunes in a particular area, or it could be rocks that were left behind from a retreating glacier or a rock slide or something like that. But it's basically bare rock. So if you take a look at this picture, think of this as a timeline, and we're moving this direction to go forward in time, right? So we start off with bare rock, and then we have these things called pioneer species that come in, like lichens. Lichens kind of colonize the rock. They get on there. They actually trap moisture and water. And then through a heating and cooling process and evaporation and those type of things, we begin to have the rock break up and form soil. Once we start getting soil, then we get these other species, these small annuals, plants, grasses that kind of move in, and then eventually they can become larger plants like shrubs and maybe shade intolerant trees such as pines or conifers. And then eventually it can develop into a full-fledged climax community, which would be a full forest ecosystem, right? So that's primary succession. The part that takes the most time is going from this bare rock to producing the soil. That can literally take hundreds of years, okay? Hundreds of years for that to occur. Secondary succession, on the other hand, happens at a much quicker rate because the soil is already there. So secondary succession follows a major disturbance like a fire or a flood, and the stages of secondary succession are similar to those of primary succession, but they kind of move along faster because we already have a buildup of soil in the environment. So we have this soil here, we have a full ecosystem, right? A forest ecosystem, a fire occurs, maybe it burns it out, and then usually not hundreds of years later, but within 1 or 2 years, you might have annuals and grasses starting to show up, and then maybe anywhere from 5 to 150 years, you'll start getting these immature, smaller shrubs and pines and smaller trees showing up, and then right around 150 years, you can have it back to the mature forest that we once had. So this happens at a much quicker pace because we don't have to wait for rocks to be broken down into soil. So anytime a change is imposed in the ecosystem and it causes one or more species living there to either die out or move out of the area, the effects can actually be devastating to the ecosystem. The ecosystem health is dependent on biodiversity, so if we have all these organisms leave the ecosystem, then we reduce the biodiversity and we reduce the health of the overall ecosystem. So reducing that biodiversity will have a negative impact on the overall health. So there's other things that can be affected by changing ecosystems besides biodiversity. So besides reducing biodiversity, here are some other characteristics of an ecosystem that might change if the conditions of the ecosystem change. The overall size of the ecosystem might be different. And the example here is back to our wildfire, right? If the wildfire destroys part of the forest, we actually reduce the overall size of the forest itself. We could look at density, the amount of different species and the number of those species. A good example for this would be a parasite that targets a certain coral species in a reef, that picture we showed at the beginning. So if it targets a species of coral and that coral disappears, well, then the reef will become less dense. The coral die off, and other species maybe that depend on the coral for producing their habitat, they might begin to disappear too, and you'll have less density in the population. The distribution could change, right? How the different species and organisms are spread out in an ecosystem. An example here would be an invasive species that's introduced and it kills off a number of plants. Well, those plants become more sparse or spaced out in the ecosystem. This can have an effect, especially when pollinators try to visit the plants. If it's a flowering plant and have to spread the pollen, it might be more difficult to get pollination occurring. And then we have genetic variation. The differences in DNA sequences among the population can be changed. For example, if we have a flamingo population and a virus comes in and kills 80% of the flamingo population, this is going to reduce the overall genetic variation within that flamingo population, making them less diverse as far as their genetic diversity goes. All right, and that moves us into keystone species. So let's briefly talk about what a keystone species is and why they're important. Then we'll give you some examples of these, and I'll give you one specific example. And we'll, I said I would add a link, and it's in the notes, but I'll also add it to the spot right below where I put this video. So it'll be another video. It's a little 5-minute video on wolves. Okay. So a keystone species has a crucial role in the way an ecosystem functions. It has a much larger effect on its environment relative to its abundance. So there's two important characteristics that kind of determine if an organism is a keystone species. First, their presence is crucial in maintaining the integrity of the ecosystem through species diversity and organization. And they are relatively more important in structuring their ecosystem when compared to most other species of equal biomass found within their community. So let's look at an example of this. And one huge example is the gray wolf. Okay, so the gray wolf, and I'm going to kind of give you the reverse of what the video does. The reverse, basically, I'm going to talk about how when the wolves were removed, what happened, and then the video talks about how these wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone and what occurred. Okay, so when we're removing or reducing the number of keystone species, this causes a cascade of events, right? And sometimes it has an effect on organisms that aren't directly related to the wolf. For example, when wolves were removed or hunted almost into extinction in a particular area of Yellowstone, well, that had an effect on the rivers. It actually caused the rivers to change course, and it caused a temperature change in the waters, which reduced the number of fish. And the wolves really don't feed off the fish directly, so we wouldn't expect that to happen. It's a cascade of events that can occur. So let's look at this example. Once abundant throughout the western United States, the gray wolf was almost driven to extinction by human persecution. Basically, the ranchers and farmers in the area were protecting their livestock, and they hunted the wolves, right? So as the wolves disappeared from the Yellowstone National Park ecosystem in the early 1900s, this is going to cause increase in elk population. This is because the wolves were no longer hunting the elk. So the elk population started to go up really high. Now, this caused a problem because the elk started overgrazing numerous plant species, right? Some of the local flora actually went extinct, right? So this heavy grazing by the elk prevented tree seedlings from reaching maturity. And then the fact that over time the natural attrition of large trees along creeks and rivers decreased, the stream banks stability and the canopy cover and the shade kind of changed. The rivers began to erode into the banks of the river and change course of the rivers overall. And also the lack of canopy and shade caused water temperatures to be increased, which then in turn reduced the abundance of some fish species within the park. So we can see this huge cascade of events, right? So as you can see, not only did the loss of the gray wolf affect the number of elk in the park, it had a cascading effect over the entire ecosystem. Keystone species positively influence biodiversity because they play a crucial role in structuring and maintaining the integrity of the ecosystem. So this is that video, and I really highly encourage you. It's like a 5-minute video, and it talks about the wolves and how they are able to be reintroduced into Yellowstone and what effect it had on the overall ecosystem.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So, as you could see, pretty significant little video, kind of high impact video showing the reverse of what I just described when the wolves were removed. So let's look at a few other keystone species before we finish this up. We got sharks are a type of keystone species. They help maintain certain aquatic ecosystems. We talked about a little bit about beavers, and there's also sea otters, snowshoe hare. African elephant is a keystone species. The prairie dogs, starfish kind of help keep certain tide pool ecosystems in check. The grizzly bear is a keystone species. Hummingbirds are considered a keystone species. Not just animals, also plants. The saguaro cactus is a keystone species. Certain types of fig trees are keystone species. And we also talked about in that video, it mentioned the beavers being a keystone species. So that was another one that was pretty huge because they basically dam up the rivers and cause these aquatic ecosystems to kind of flourish. So lots of different types of keystone species. This is obviously not the full list, but that just kind of shows you a few of these different organisms and what can be considered keystone species. All right, so for this week, make sure you do all the self-checks. Watch all the videos, obviously. And then the two assignments are 3.4, which is the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health Science Notebook, and then the Biodiversity Review on 3.5. Your first unit test will be open Friday. I'm going to do, on Friday for you guys, I'm going to do a quick review using some of the questions straight out of the test. That will be hugely beneficial, so make sure you get there on time. I'm going to kind of go through as much as I can. And then right after that 30-minute live lesson for the review, the test will be opened up for you so you can start taking it. I will leave it open until Saturday at midnight. That gives you all afternoon on Friday to get it done. And then if you can't get to it then and you have to work on it on Saturday, you can't. Now, normally this test would be done in about a 45 to 52-minute class period. I'm leaving it open for 90 minutes, so there shouldn't be any problem with not having enough time to get it done. So it's basically twice as long as than it normally is, all right? Make sure you set aside a time when you won't be interrupted or disturbed. No little brothers or sisters bothering you, or everything's done and nobody's going to come in and interrupt you in the middle of your quiz, because that might cut into some of the time that you have available. Okay, guys? So again, kind of make sure that you set yourself up so that you have enough time to get it done. If you can't get it done Friday, then make sure you go back and do it on Saturday. Once again, good luck on the quiz, and thank you very much.